All right, good morning everyone. My name's Mathew Lyneham and this is Andy Chan, and we conduct research into homicides and deaths in custody in Australia. Before we begin, I think it's important to acknowledge that what we're going to be talking today about are unnatural deaths, which can often be unexpected or violent. So on behalf of the Australian Government, I think it's important to express our sincerest condolences to all the family and friends of anyone that has died an unnatural death in Australia. When I was at Melbourne Uni, I found one of the hardest things about studying criminology was convincing people that it's more than just CSI. And 4 years later, I'm still having that difficulty. Finally, in the event that you ask us a tricky question or we say something wrong, Jason and Tracy, who oversee these programs, will be here to assist. Now, among other things, part of the AIC's function is to monitor serious incidents such as unnatural deaths and to contribute to national indicators around harm. Today we're going to be talking about two of the monitoring programs that perform this function, the National Deaths in Custody and the National Homicide Monitoring Programs. Forgive me if I constantly refer to them in their letter form, because that's all we do all day is talk about acronyms. The data collected by these programs have become key crime and justice indicators and have formed part of the Productivity Commission's annual review of government services. Information about each homicide incident is provided directly to the AIC by homicide squads of each police agency. Similarly, information about deaths in custody is provided directly by the custodial authority. As we receive each case, information is validated against and supplemented by court records and transcripts, as well as coronial findings, autopsy reports and toxicology. The aim, therefore, of these programs is to provide an evidence base and to contribute to ongoing discussions around reform and how the criminal justice system can better respond to these deaths. Overall, the aim of our presentation is to talk about the key trends that have emerged from more than 20 years of monitoring unnatural deaths. Drawing upon the available data, we're going to have focus on 5 key issues, namely self-inflicted deaths in prison, deaths in motor vehicle pursuits, the prevalence of mental illness. We're going to look at risk factors for an unnatural death, and finally Andy's going to talk about some vulnerable populations. Each section will include an overview of what we know, as well as in areas in need of further research. The reason why we don't know answers to some of these questions is because they're very difficult questions to answer. The hope is that today we can generate some discussion at the end about these issues. So what exactly is an unnatural death? Well, as the definition suggests, it's any death not from natural causes. And this definition is derived from that which appears in every Coroner's Act. Now, how does the criminal justice system respond to an unnatural death? Well, there are a few matters to which the criminal justice system devotes more time and effort than an unnatural death. There are, however, some minor differences in the criminal justice system response to a homicide and to a death in custody. For both deaths, the response begins when the death is reported to the police. In the case of deaths in custody, the matter must also be reported to the state or deputy state coroner. The process of gathering evidence then begins. The main point of difference, is when the matter reaches court. Homicides are dealt with by a criminal court, whereas deaths in custody are dealt with by a coroner's court. The function of a criminal court is to work out who is responsible for the death. A criminal court is adversarial. The function of a coroner's court, however, is to determine the facts of the case, namely who died, when and where did they die, what caused the death and how did it occur? In the event that a coroner feels that there is sufficient evidence that a known person may have committed an offence in relation to a death in custody, the matter is then referred to the Director of Public Prosecutions for possible criminal proceedings. Now, in the event that a coroner recognises that there may be some deficiencies in the system or things that could be done better in the future that may prevent a death in custody from occurring, they'll hand down recommendations which must be acted upon by the relevant authority. Now, the first issue we're going to talk about today is the decline in self-inflicted deaths in prison. Over 30 years' worth of data has shown that, particularly in the last decade or so, there's been a considerable decline. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, deaths resulting from self-inflicted injuries, such as hangings, were generally the most prevalent type of cause or type of death in prison each year. Following the peak in 1998, there has been a consistent annual decline, with the numbers recorded in both 2006 and 2007 being the lowest in over 20 years. A fourth-order polynomial regression confirmed this trend, and that's the red line. So what do we know? Well, one of the drivers of this trend is associated with age, in that the majority of persons self-inflicting their death throughout the 1980s and 90s were younger prisoners under the age of 25. Over these 2 decades, 39%, or 2 in 5 self-inflicted deaths, was of a young prisoner under the age of 25. However, we can see since the late 1990s, the proportion of such deaths among younger prisoners has dropped to just 19%. So in other words, we've seen a 50% reduction in self-inflicted deaths amongst younger prisoners. Another key driver for this decline is a reduction in the number of self-inflicted deaths amongst unsentenced prisoners or remandees. For example, analysis of the data show that throughout the 80s, 83% of all unsentenced prisoner deaths were self-inflicted. During the 90s, this dropped to 72%, and then in the most recent decade, again it dropped to 64%. So in other words, it's been a 20% reduction in self-inflicted deaths amongst unsentenced prisoners. It is widely acknowledged that entering the prison system for the first time, particularly as a younger prisoner, can be a very difficult and daunting time. It is therefore vitally important that we fully understand the unique risks associated with this cohort, and to develop strategies to try and further reduce the number of self-inflicted deaths. There are, however, some issues that we need to explore further with regards to this type of death. The key is to untangling this issue is to better understand which of these factors is contributing and to what extent they're contributing. We think it has a lot to do with a reduction in the number of hanging points in cells. This was a recommendation handed down by the Royal Commission that custodial authorities should do everything they can to try and reduce hanging points. And that's certainly, there's been millions and millions of dollars invested over the last 20 years to try and address that. At the same time, there's also, I think, been better screening for self-harm and better monitoring of prisoners deemed at risk. We're still looking into this matter further, and we're trying to work closely with corrective services agencies to try and really quantify how much these issues or factors might be contributing to this decline. And the results from that research will be released later this year. Another interesting finding from 20 years' worth of monitoring are deaths in motor vehicle pursuits. The National Deaths in Custody program does not monitor deaths of innocent passengers and third parties, and this is because they don't meet the definition of a death in custody. This is because they're not persons in the process of being detained, and had they survived, they would have been free to leave. So this data gap was identified, and it's important to build our understanding of precisely the amount of harm that motor vehicle pursuits are causing in terms of fatalities. The AIC is currently working with police agencies to try and quantify the nature of that harm and to better understand those pursuits that end in fatality. The hope is that we can understand what are the unique risks associated with police, and we're going to try and develop strategies which mitigate many of those risks. Again, those findings are almost complete, and we'll be releasing them in the coming months. How many motor vehicle pursuit fatalities have there been? Since 1 January 1990, there have been just over 300 deaths occurring in a pursuit type situation, with approximately 60% being deaths of alleged offenders, and the remaining 40% being deaths of passengers and other road users. If we draw a line at 2000, which represents the period from which we were able to collect deaths of innocent passengers and other road users, we can see that overall the numbers of deaths each year have dropped slightly, with the obvious exception of 2008-9, where there was a considerable spike. Well, what does the available data that we do have show about these incidents? Well, since 2000, the total number of pursuit-related deaths each year has declined slightly. Are more innocent people being killed? Well, analysis of the data show that the highest year was in 2002-3, but since then there's been a slight reduction. Are we seeing more dangerous pursuits than ever before? Well, this is a tricky question to answer. We have some indicators around speed. We track speeds reached in pursuits, and we also track the length of pursuit in terms of time. If we use these as indicators, there is no evidence to suggest that pursuits are becoming more dangerous. Both have remained fairly stable over the last 20 years. Finally, how many pursuits are drug or alcohol related? Well, of the alleged offenders, which is almost always the driver, 85% were found through toxicology screening to have alcohol, drugs, or a combination of both in their system when they died. In one case, alarmingly, the driver had 7 different types of illegal substances in their system, and they were all at very high levels. So, over 20 years worth of capturing data around motor vehicle pursuit fatalities, we can build a bit of a profile of these incidents, and that's important for law enforcement to better respond. We can see that more than half are young males under the age of 25. Almost half occur late at night between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. And almost 2 in every 3 occurs in a regional remote area, so that's anywhere that's not a capital city. There are some things that we're looking to explore further, and we're hoping that maybe you can come up with some ideas for how we can assist. We need to know better about the kinds of offences that are leading to pursuits. We know all the offences that lead to the fatal pursuits, but not all the others. Unfortunately, also, we don't know how many pursuits end in arrest. We know how many end in fatality, but we don't know arrest rates. And we also don't know escape rates. So it's important to try and get a bit of understanding of the nature and risks associated with pursuits. So look forward to the research we're releasing later this year. That's it for me now, and I'll hand over to Andy Chan.
So, both Deaths in Custody and the Homicide Monitoring Program collect data on mental health. For deaths in custody, this relates to the deceased persons. For homicide, it relates to offenders. We tend not to report this variable in our homicide annual report, and in the past we haven't for deaths in custody, but for the first time we have a section on mental health for our forthcoming annual report. The reasons we usually don't report this information centers on the other caveats we have to have in place for the data. We all know that there is considerable research evidence about the complexities surrounding the identification of mental health issues, generally and specifically for the criminal justice system personnel. The AIC initially gets mental health information from our data providers, the police, and corrections. But we don't record it unless it is verified by the court. The reasons we do this should be fairly obvious, and that is because we don't know the basis upon which the police or corrections personnel have identified a mental health issue. Court documents, however, can provide some context and often the specific issue or disorder the person was experiencing. As researchers, we have to consider the quality of the data we receive, the purpose of disseminating it, what exactly are the research or policy development questions that we're trying to answer, and just who are we trying to inform. Now let me just focus on the NHMP. In our data collection form for the Homicide Monitoring Program, we asked police to identify whether there is evidence of the killing being related to a mental health or psychopathic condition of the offender. Also, we asked the police whether the person had an intellectual disability, suffered from depression, or a psychotic condition. But for the purposes of understanding homicide, we need to know more than that. We want to know what are the contributing factors that led to the commission of the offence, and whether it was a mitigating factor when assessing the culpability of the offender for the crime. Since most people with mental health problems do not commit crimes, we can't assume that the presence of an issue means a direct causal link to the offence, and we have to be very careful about labelling an offender with a mental health issue if there isn't sufficient or accepted evidence that one exists. Our data in the NHMP therefore only shows that approximately 8% of homicide victims over the last 21 years of monitoring have been killed by persons with a known or recognized mental health disorder or psychopathic condition. Less than 0.5% have been killed by someone with an intellectual disability. All this means is that these are the cases we can confirm. To truly understand the presence and impact of mental health issues would require a complete review of all of our data and any court records available to these cases. The best we can do is ensure our data reflects what we know at the time we produce the annual reports, and that we update our data when new information comes to light. We also have to be clear about what are we talking about when we discuss mental health, so not to add any misconceptions. So our data is the best we can get to answer these questions. Whether we are looking at homicides or deaths in custody, we still need to be clear about whether we are talking about diagnosable mental health conditions or non-clinical problems. We need to understand whether the problem is brought on by or exacerbated by the misuse of drugs and alcohol, and ultimately, what the criminal justice system response needs to be for persons affected by mental health or cognitive disabilities. Our team is currently working on how mental health is used in the courts in determining guilt and sentencing. This project is actually drawing on the honours thesis of one of my colleagues. I just want to highlight some of the common characteristics of a homicide victim. So first of all, who makes up the majority of the victims? Men have remained overrepresented as both the victim and offender in a homicide incident over the last 21 years. The average age of victims killed are typically around the mid-30s, with little difference in the age of males and females. The vast majority of homicide incidents involve a single victim and a single offender in a residential location. The highest number of homicides occur between the evening and early mornings on weekends and are most likely to have involved the use of alcohol. Finally, there are more deaths resulting from stab wounds than any other single cause, while the use of firearms, particularly handguns, has decreased in the last 10 years. So what does this mean? Well, now that we have a better understanding of the common characteristics, it is also necessary to bear in mind that there are also special populations which exist. These are groups of victims which bring about added interest towards various policymakers and practitioners. The particular ones which I like to highlight today are Indigenous persons, children, and intimate partners. Unchallenged is the fact that there needs to be further research which looks more closely at Indigenous populations to try and determine why are they more vulnerable to being victims of a homicide compared to the non-Indigenous population. Our data shows that the Indigenous people are 4 times more likely to be victims of a homicide. This overrepresentation has been declining over the last few years, but it is still high, especially for female Indigenous women. In particular, the Indigenous population would benefit from further research into the issues of domestic violence and whether or not it could potentially lead to domestic homicides. In fact, over half of the homicide victims were in a domestic relationship with the offender. Alcohol is another area which warrants further discussion or whether or not there needs to be a revision of existing prevention programs. This in part is because 68% of all Indigenous victims were recorded as having alcohol in their system. Approximately 28% of Indigenous victims were killed by an acquaintance or close friend, so there is scope for additional research to look at the social interactions of Indigenous persons, particularly the role that alcohol might play. Apart from analysing incidents of homicide from a victim perspective, we can also approach from a different angle, such as considering whether there are potentially more deaths due to the difficulties in accessing medical assistance in more remote areas, or whether there are issues with identifying victims from different cultural backgrounds. These are just some of the questions that are worth exploring. So another special population, as mentioned before, are children. In incidents where a parent kills a child, it is defined as a filicide. Overall, despite the media's common portrayal of child-related deaths by a parent as a growing concern, findings from the NHMP have shown that there is in fact not been a significant increase. Rather, the frequency of offending has stayed relatively stable over the last 21 years. In the 21 years of reporting, filicides have made up approximately 8% of the total number of homicides per year. This is approximately 25 deaths per year. Most of these incidents involve just one parent, but some involve both parents or a parent and another person. And there are a roughly equal number of mothers and fathers that kill their children. Although the international literature suggests that involvement of a step-parent in many of these incidents, our data has not come to the same conclusion. Despite the rarity, it is important to investigate why these incidents occur in the first place. The AIC has provided data on filicides to the media and recently to a major report by the Domestic Violence Research Centre in Victoria on filicides in the context of parental separation. Even though the media is interested in these cases, the majority of deaths of a child under 18 are by their peers or other persons. The last population which I would like to give attention to are those relating to an intimate partner homicide. Intimate partner homicides refer to homicides where both the victim and offender share a current or former relationship. This includes spouses, ex-spouses, de facto relationships, boyfriends and girlfriends, or girlfriends, partners in same-sex relationships, and those that are similar to these in nature. Over the last 21 years, intimate partner homicide has made up approximately a quarter of all homicides in Australia. The purpose of highlighting this population today is, however, not to inform you about how many intimate partner homicides there are, rather to bring attention to the fact that intimate partner homicide is not always as simple as people generally perceive it to be. It's not always a female victim killed by a male partner after years of abuse, though these cases can make up the majority of incidents. Men are sometimes victims, as are same-sex partners. Sometimes intimate partners are killed for other reasons, such as those involving financial gain or mercy killings. The AIC is currently researching homicides between same-sex couples, and I'm doing a qualitative examination of the situational circumstances of intimate partner homicides between 2008 and 2010. So, we've used this presentation today to highlight what we do, what we know, and where we're going. So we hope that this has given you some ideas of your own. Thank you.